أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعد الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam. My respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. عظم الله وجودنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Have the Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam mentioned global warming specifically in their ahadith to us? How do we deal with a climate change that is rooted in scientific analysis and evidence for an approaching catastrophe and disaster? How do fuqaha, our maraja al-kiram, may Allah bless them, navigate between Quran, ahadith and scientific literature such that there is not only a balance between these, but deriving laws in accordance with the latest scientific data, especially when it comes to the matters of global warming and climate change? What we want to do tonight, inshaAllah, is try to pick one mas'ala which is very controversial, which is very difficult for us to be able to think about, and try to look at how the Quran, the ahadith, and the scientific literature all have different approaches and different conclusions to this one matter. Now, of course, you and I are not mujtahideen here, but we can understand the processes involved and also try to help ourselves when we become more aware of some of the scientific literature that gives us guidance in accordance with the challenges of our time. And so, inshaAllah, what we will do tonight is pick one fiqhi mas'ala that is on the verge of our purview that we need to be able to discuss. And then this, inshaAllah, will help us to be able to imagine the flavor of which ijtihad is having to navigate these challenges that are appearing in front of our eyes. The first thing we have to realize is that when it comes to our discussions of the last 2 nights and tonight, there has been a sequence of thought. 2 nights ago, we started questioning about an eco-theology and an eco-ethics, how we interact with the universe, what we imagine our relationship to the universe to be. And we stated it could either be egocentric, it could either be homocentric, or it can be ecocentric. And ecocentric states that the rest of the planet, the rest of creation, has a right to flourish, just like you and I have a right to flourish. And we looked at the story of Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam and his approach to the Wadi al-Naml, and that if this was to be destroyed, then this would have been something that was either egocentric or homocentric. This would have been destroyed for his own desire or for the desire of the army that was walking with him. Of course, this could never be the case. And so ensuring the protection, the preservation of the valley of the ants demonstrated to us an eco-friendly worldview. Then yesterday, we moved into the maqasid al-bi'ah. And if you recall, we said the maqasid are those things which are universal common goods that need to be preserved and protected. Otherwise, the harm is going to be reverberating across our existence. We mentioned ayat that talked about how Allah Jalla Jalaluhu has placed the mountains as pegs in the earth. And that if you break those pegs, if you pull up those pegs, if you put holes into those pegs, then when those pegs break, the mountains break and the earth convulses. And tamida bikum, the Quran says. In the same way, when we come to realize that there are certain things that need to be preserved, this feeds into the way in which we understand our ahkam and the way in which we begin to imagine a set of laws that are going to govern our practices, either when we are interacting with the natural world or when we are interacting with each other or with anything that we produce. There is a hadith, for example, from our sixth Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, where the Imam says that to secure a wholesome environment, a society must possess three qualities. The hadith is as follows. Life is not pleasant without three things. Number one, clean air. Number two, abundant fresh water. And three, fertile land. Can you see how the whole of the environmental issue is placed within these three things? And that Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have told us these narrations so far in advance to help us to understand some of these matters. Some of the challenges that we have today is that the language that we use is constantly shifting, and the way in which we begin to understand the scientific literature can be very heavy for us. Many of us here are not scientists. It is something even of interest to us. Sometimes when we hear about these problems, we close our eyes to it. It's overwhelming. It's almost, sometimes it can become quite boring. Sometimes it can become too much for us to fathom. Sometimes the task at hand seems so unfathomable. We say to ourselves, I'm just one person. What can I do? If I make this one change, in reality, it won't make even the slightest amount of difference. We have to realize that actually this is the plan of those who wish to be able to pull the wool over our eyes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran time and time again, do not lose hope. Why? Because when you and I give up, then what we are essentially saying is that neither does Allah have the power to make any change, nor do I have any value anymore as a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I don't imagine my place within the creation has any value, any benefit anymore. And so I begin to give up. And then of course someone else gives up and someone else gives up. And as an outcome, none of us feel like we can make any changes. This is actually something that has been devised in the language that is used in order to make us feel despondent, in order for us to despair from the power that we have in the palms of our hands. It's really interesting if you notice the language that always enters into the media narratives. the words and the language that has been used has been checked by pollsters to understand our human reaction to these words, and the ones that work on our minds are then presented into the media for it to become part of the language, the discourse amongst ourselves. Let me give you an example and you'll understand it. Prior to 2020, mid 2020, so last year, be honest, is there anyone here who had ever heard of such a thing like a vaccine passport? You'd heard of it? Prior to the pandemic? No, I'm asking, prior to the pandemic, was that language there? No, it wasn't. Now when we hear the words vaccine passport, what does that term elucidate in your mind? That we cannot go anywhere without it. Passports are obviously those documents for travel. And so I cannot go anywhere without it. And so a vaccine passport has been introduced, that language, someone had to invent that term. Prior to last year, it did not exist. You will not find it. Someone had to invent the term and then put a spin on it as to whether it is a positive thing or a negative thing, such that when it then reaches us, it has circulated enough for you and I to immediately have a context as to whether it is positive or whether it is negative. Do you understand? Prior to a time, it did not exist. This term, this phraseology did not exist. A pollster has to have sat down with 100 people and taken from them, what are your fears? What do you imagine is going to be a problem for you with this pandemic? And then having understood the fears of the people and the language that they use, either they find a term that is used or they coin a term which reflects the fears of something, of someone, and then they put it into the media and it spreads in the media, and then we hear it, we hear it, we hear it, we hear it. Think about every term you've ever heard. Herd immunity. Herd immunity is a scientific term. Arguably, herd immunity is a scientific term, which is that 80% of people or more need to have reached immunity. But we'll come back to that. That's a very good point about science and language in science, which we're coming to in a second. Ahsantum. I'll give you another one. Or maybe you can tell me one. Give me a famous phrase around the issue of Brexit. You know, in the 2019 election, Bojo introduced a term, oven ready. Anyone remember? Oven ready? Deal. Now, what was the idea behind that? Prior to that, the phrase was, get Brexit done. What you'll have to understand is that this government works on slogans with 3 words in it. Hands, face, space. This government, and they've understood it, there's actually a book called 10 Techniques to Propaganda. Second lesson of propaganda is reduce everything to 3-word slogans. Honestly, it's out there. Get Brexit done. Oven ready, deal. So the idea is that you simplify a message in such a way that it becomes digestible, but the way in which you present it, you've already captured the spirit of it or something, you captured the notion of it, and then it goes into the ecology of the discourse, and everybody repeats it. When you're in the taxi, it's on the radio. When you get to work, someone's using the same words. It becomes a reinforcement every time someone uses it. When you and I have an oven-ready meal, what's being said is that it's already ready, it's already cooked, you just have to heat it up. So you put it in the microwave for 3 minutes. You put it in the oven for 15 minutes at gas mark somewhere, you pull it out. What was Bojo trying to say? I've already done the deal. All I have to do is just get elected and do it. And most of the country fell for it. Correct or not? Do you understand? The language that is used, the slogans, the terms that are introduced, for a minute, understand where they come from. And how easy it is to trick the mind and make us go along with terms. Vaccine passport was only introduced as a scare tactic. Because everybody here knows that when you need to travel, there are certain vaccinations that you need to get. It's normal, isn't it? Who here does not have their BCG? If you didn't have your BCG, you wouldn't be allowed in school. Until then, no one used the term vaccine passport. We always had an immunization certificate or little chart. Now it's become vaccine passport. Why the language change? Why from immunization certificate or card to something new? It's not new. I'm not talking about the efficacy of the vaccine, take it or don't take it. Understand, I'm talking about language to you. Yeah, the way in which language is used for you to either be falling for tricks or they lay a trap open for you. When they want to scare you, when they want to take you in a direction, all they have to do is get a pollster to understand a term or to create a term that reflects the feelings of people, and then they put it into the newspapers and everybody starts talking about it. It becomes a norm. The person who does this or did this on behalf of George W. Bush and the person who started to do it for Boris Johnson last year is an individual by the name of Frank Luntz. Get your phones out, everybody, inshallah, and just Google this name, Frank, and then the surname is Luntz. Frank Luntz. Once you Googled it, just put it down, because concentrate on me and I'll tell you about him. You can read his Wikipedia profile in your own time, inshallah, yeah? I will suggest that Frank Luntz is one of the most evil people alive on the planet today. And you can read him for yourself and tell me if you agree or disagree in your own time, maybe tomorrow, inshallah. Mr. Luntz is a pollster. Previously for the Republican Party under George W. Bush. And now he's come over to the sunny shores of England to help our friend Boris Johnson with his own polling. What this man does is that he gets 50 people in a room and he starts asking them questions about whatever the subject matter is. And he hears them out. And he hears the language that they use, the fears that they have, and then he coins phrases for the problem in order to shift it for the sake of whoever pays him the most. Whichever corporation pays him, whichever political party pays him, he does this for a living. He did one very famously. This is well known, well documented. Mr. Luntz was asked by George W. Bush to shift the language around global warming in order for people to no longer think that global warming is happening or that global warming is a problem for people. Since the 1950s, we have known as a matter of fact and science of this issue. But Mr. Luntz was told that our corporations are going to lose. I mean, if you got a gas-guzzling car or you produce a gas-guzzling car and you know that you're being told this is damaging the environment, the gas-guzzling cars need to have a shift in language so that people are no longer scared of global warming. So they went to George W. Bush and said, we need you to be able to shift the language, stop people being so afraid of global warming. He went to his friend, the pollster, Mr. Luntz. He gathered 100 people into a room and he started to ask them questions. He started to look through the scientific literature. And then he told George Bush the following on how to deal with the matter. This is a matter of record, huh? He said the words global warming have been circulating amongst people so much that the moment it is word, it essentially has, or it has, not essentially, it has adopted a negative meaning to it. It has become associated with a negative meaning. The moment I use the word global warming, you immediately know there's a problem. It's not said in a good context, is it? It's not like, oh, happy days, let's, global warming means you're all going to get a free burger meal. It means that there's a problem. And it is scientific. Mr. Luntz said, what we need to do is to inject into the language, into the media discourse, a new term that is neutral, and that over time you can have enough people thinking that it is not a problem. So you take one word out of the discussion and you introduce a new word into the discussion. This word was climate change. Global warming, scary. Climate change, neutral. The climate changes. It's always changed. We've had a previous ice age 22,000 years ago. We had another ice age before that and before that. And before. It happens. The climate goes up and down. And so Frank Luntz was the one to introduce this language. It was already there in scientific literature, climate change. But he adopted it, placed within it a notion, and then presented it to people. This is the first thing. The second thing that Mr. Luntz did, and again, this is very interesting for you, and understand that these things happen in front of your eyes. What they did was that they introduced into all media, mainstream media channels, the idea that there is no scientific consensus on global warming. There's some scientists that say it's happening. There's other scientists that say it's not happening. And so it's, scholars have difference of opinion. Scientists have difference of opinion. So we're not sure what's happening. Actually, there is a 99.3% scientific consensus on global warming being a human-made concept. There was more than 1,000 peer-reviewed articles reviewed, and then they understood the extent over several years, the scientific consensus on this matter. Now think about this. If you are watching CNN or Sky News or BBC, and there's two panelists, one panelist says, big problem, other one says, no problem. You are forced into thinking that this is an equal fight, isn't it? That there's a difference of opinion, one argument here, one argument there. And if that happens year after year, decade after decade, that all of the oil companies, the gas companies, the car manufacturing companies, they sponsor research in order to be able to put someone onto CNN every time there's a discussion, every time there's a debate. Then you and I imagine that there's no consensus. This is exactly what they do. In science and in life, sometimes there aren't two opinions on things. There's only one opinion. Sometimes there's not two opinions, there's 5 opinions. But if I only ever present to you 2 opinions, for the rest of the decade, you will imagine that there are only 2 opinions on this issue. Tell me, and I know I run a risk here, but is the earth round or flat? Huh? Who said flat? Get out. I'm going to say there's a scientific, absolute human consensus that the earth is round. But if CNN puts onto its channel for 10 years, one person, the earth is flat and the earth is round, and they begin to debate it and debate it and debate it, when people watch it and they grow up for a generation, they imagine that there's 2 opinions. There isn't 2 opinions here. The earth, I'm sorry to tell you, is not flat. If you understand that these are 2 ways in which, for a number of decades, the wool has been pulled over the eyes of the people, you will also reflect in on yourself as to say, How many times have I been duped by these people? The language that they used and they inserted into the discourse, the way in which they presented things as if, one argument and then there's another argument and these two things are equal. Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have told us that at the end of time, there is going to be destruction of civilization. Have they told us specifically about warming at the end of time or not? If I was to show you a narration where Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam say that at the end of time there will be warming, what will you say? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. You know why? Because to predict something like that, it is not possible for someone of an ordinary nature to be able to state something in that way that is so phenomenal, that something that is occurring now and that is supposed to be bringing about an apocalyptic way of living in the world today. So let me give you a narration example about the general destruction of civilization at the end of time, and then let me show you Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam talking about global warming in and of itself. Hadith, first one, from the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Hadith, the Prophet actually gives a series of signs of the end of time and conditions for the end of time coming about. For example, I'm just taking two. Ibn Mas'ud, إن من أعلام الساعة وأشراطها أن يكون المطر القيضا. O Ibn Mas'ud, from amongst the signs of the time and the conditions for the end of the time, أن يكون المطر القيضا, burning rain or acid rain. Is it possible for an ordinary human being to have said those words? Is there anyone, is there a Nostradamus, is there any other prophet who has ever said anything like that? At the end of time, acid rain, burning rain is going to occur. Is there anyone here who is not aware that we have acid rain? Ibn Mas'ud, إن من أعلام الساعة وأشراطها أن يعمر خراب الدنيا ويخرب عمرانها. Ibn Mas'ud, at the end of time, the signs and the conditions for the end of time is that there is destruction of the earth, of أن يعمر خراب الدنيا ويخرب عمرانها, and even the destruction of civilization itself. We have many of these. But of course, these are just general, aren't they? What about an Imam of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam using the word warming about the end of time? This hadith comes to us from our 8th Imam, Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. One of the companions says, and there's a full chain, but I won't go through that for now. Companion says, سمعت الرضا عليه السلام يقول قبل هذا الأمر, before this affair, this event, and you all know Amr is referring to what? Imam Al-Mahdi عجل الله تعالى فرج الشريف. اللهم صل على محمد. قبل هذا الأمر, so before the advent of Imam عليه السلام, بيوح. قبل هذا الأمر بيوح. The hadith says, فلم أدري ما البيوح. Companion says, I didn't understand the word buyuh. I didn't understand what the Imam meant by this. فحججت. So I went on Hajj, the companion says. فسمعت أعرابيا يقول, and I heard an Arab say, or maybe Arabi, a desert dweller say, هذا يوم بيوح. This day is a very warm day. فقلت له ما البيوح. So I said to the Arabi, what is biyuh? I heard this word from Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. You've also used this word. What is the meaning of this word? فقال, the Arabi said, الشديد الحر. How do I translate شديد الحر so that no one, so I don't say it. What do you say it? الشديد, extreme, حر, extremely hot. قبل هذا الأمر بيوح. What's the meaning? What's ما معنى البيوح? الشديد الحر. Extreme warmth, extreme heat. I think our 8th Imam, Ali ibn Musa al-Ridha, deserves a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This is the reality of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. That even though people will play with the words in front of you, understand that Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam have given us this directive, and that there is a scientific consensus around this particular matter. And it should be an honor for us that since time before, Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam have warned us of these matters, such that we, the Shia, should have been at the tip of the sword when dealing with these matters, not lagging behind, waiting for others to be able to inform us of this matter. Now, you may also know that the earth reached a new level. The month of July just gone. Which month are we in now? August. Last month, July, was the hottest ever on record globally. قبل هذا الأمر بيوح. July just gone is the hottest ever month in the record of humanity since we've been taking records, some 150 years. It is now 1.6 degrees above the 20th century average. And I'm sure you all know by now that when it comes to the fail-safe point, it is 2 degrees. When we reach 2 degrees above, 1.5? 1.5 or 2? 2. When we reach 2 degrees above the average of the 20th century or the pre-industrial revolution period, we have gone past the fail-safe point that the planet cannot come back from. We are 0.4 degrees away from it. And so the more fossil fuel that we release, the more methane that we release, the more that these capture the heat inside. And this is the greenhouse gases, and this keeps the warmth within the earth. This warms up the planet, the surface. It melts the ice caps. More water enters into the oceans, and more problems come into the climate, such that you have seen in the last few weeks, sometimes it is so hot, forest fires are raging. Sometimes it is so hot, fish are literally being fried alive because it is too hot for them. Sometimes there is too much water and it causes floods. قبل هذا الأمر بيوح. Now, for you and I to be able to deal with this issue, what we find is that the masail that would have to come out of this would have to be very urgent responses to this issue. If we only have a fail-safe point of 2030 or 2040 or 2050, depending on scientific understanding, if we only have a decade or 2 decades to be able to stop this occurrence, it tells us that the ahkam that governs our lives has to be urgently placed in front of us for us to be able to respond accordingly. Does that make sense? The more urgent the need is, the more urgent the hukm upon us. And the more urgent there is to be able to resolve our way of living, to regulate our way of living such that we can respond accordingly. How do our maraji al-kiram deal with an urgent mas'ala like this in regards to stopping the warming of the planet. Now, I mentioned to you on a previous day, yesterday and 2 days ago, we do not have ahkam, we do not have a bab of fiqh al-bi'ah yet. May Allah help us and help our marajit to get there as quickly as possible. But that doesn't mean that we don't know how the methodologies of ijtihad work, what the ayat, what the ahadith, and what the different principles are that might go into a mas'ala. So I want to pick a mas'ala with you and then try to think about some of the issues around it. Not that I'm giving you a fatwa. I want you as an individual to take responsibility, like me, to take responsibility of our lives and the choices that we make around some of the most urgent responses that are needed in regards to the approaching crisis that sits in front of us. How do mujtahideen deal with scientific problems? First and foremost, is science allowed as part of the process of ijtihad, yes or no? Yes. Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam have told us about the importance of knowledge from these different streams. The Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alih, says the good of this world and the world to come is through ilm, is through knowledge. Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam said, knowledge is the basis of every sublime state and the culmination of every high station. Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam said, O Hisham, Allah has given two proofs of guidance for mankind, the explicit and the implicit. The explicit and external proofs are the prophets, messengers and imams. The implicit and internal proofs are in the forms of reasoning and understanding. So we are permitted to be able to take in science into our ijtihad. Now, what we find is that when it comes to using science in ijtihad, our greatest of maraji', may Allah bless them, have given us examples of the ways in which they use them. I just want to give you one example so that you appreciate how much our maraji' defer to science in order to help them reach a conclusion. Whether to accept a hadith or reject a hadith can be based on science and what we know to be factual or not. His Eminence, Grand Ayatollah As-Sayyid Abul Qasim Al-Khu'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, has a lengthy bab of ijtihad on the issue of the time of Salatul Maghrib. As you know, there are three major opinions about the time of Salatul Maghrib. Is it at ghurub time? Is it a short time after? Or is it a more delayed time after? His Eminence Sayyid Al-Khu'i goes through a lengthy debate to arrive at his conclusion. And one of the narrations, he uses science to be able to reject or accept the hadith. So the hadith comes to us. This hadith comes to us from our sixth Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. The Imam said, the time of Maghrib is when the redness from the east disappears. This is correct. We accept this part here. The next part of this same hadith is problematic. وَتَدْرِ كَيْفَ ذَلِكَ? So do you know why this is the case? قُلْتُ لَا. The companion said, I don't know. لِأَنَّ الْمَشْرِقَ مُطِلٌّ عَلَى الْمَغْرِبِ هَكَذَا. The companion was told by the Imam that the east is mutillun. It is slightly higher than the west. I know the way in which you're looking at me is the other way around, but for me, this is the east, this is my west. The Imam actually raised his right hand above his left hand and said to the companion, the east is actually higher than the west. So when the sun disappears in the west, the redness in the east will also disappear. Now tell me something. You all have basic knowledge of science. Is the east actually higher than the west? No, it's not. Actually, the earth does have an axis, doesn't it? It's on 24.5 degrees tilt of an axis, correct? Ayatollah Sayyid Abul Qasim al-Khoi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, says the following. The context of this tradition does not correspond with what we see with our eyes. Because the one who looks with his eyes towards the eastern horizon at the time of Maghrib, he will see the redness rises gradually and then it disappears. After which another redness appears on the western horizon. It is not the case that one redness that began on the eastern hemisphere remains and ascends topwards above our heads, as the narration says. This is not like zawal during the afternoon, where you know it passes over the midway point, and then at the point of zawal it comes in. Then Sayyid al-Khoi says the important line that I'm focusing on. وَالتَّجْرِبَةِ خَيْرُ الدَّلِيلِ وَأَكْبَرَ بُرْهَانٍ. And empirical evidence, scientific evidence and experience is the best evidence and the biggest proof to reject this hadith that has reached us. Yes? You understand? I'm not going into the debate of the hadith because that's not our purpose. The point I'm evidencing to you is that our grand maraji will use scientific knowledge, scientific proof in regards to arriving at their ahkam for you and I that we follow. Other maraji also say something very similar, just to show you. Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Fadlullah, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, states, إِذَا تَعَارَضَ الْعِلْمِ مَعَ الدِّينِ. If there is a contradiction between knowledge and deen, when he says knowledge here, he means scientific knowledge. فَعَلَى الدِّينِ أَن يُرَاجِعَ أَوْرَاقَهُ. It is upon the religion to return back to the scientific knowledge, not the other way around. The scientific knowledge doesn't have to find course with deen. Deen finds recourse back with science. Now, having understood this is the way in which maraji allow us to be able to think about the issue of science and religion, who can tell me, from a scientific perspective, there's not a consensus on this, but there is a large opinion. What is the single greatest contributor to global warming? Carbon dioxide is one, and the other? Methane. Carbon dioxide actually lasts longer, but it doesn't capture as much warmth. There's more carbon dioxide in the air. There's less methane. But methane captures more warmth in it and keeps more warmth. So methane actually does more damage than carbon dioxide. So the argument from scientists is that methane is probably the single biggest contributor to global warming. I'll give you a couple of quotes so that everybody's in line. Elissa Ocko, Ilissa, Elissa Ocko, O-C-K-O is the name, senior climate scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, says the following. Cutting methane emissions is the single fastest, most effective way there is to slow the rate of warming right now. Cutting what? Methane. Tiani Sun, a climate scientist that specializes in methane, says that she completely agrees. It only lasts in the atmosphere for about a decade and then it's gone. Which means if we can remove methane, it will be the single biggest drop and means to be able to return part of our climate to an ordinary way. Right? Back to the mizan. And la tataghaw fil mizan. Okay. Now, I want you and I to think as mujtahideen here. Every one of you is a mujtahid. Okay? And you are all in Bahth Kharij. Okay? You're all in your wudu, right? You've all got your notepads. Everyone's ready, yes? Okay. So, the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam is narrated to have said, La dharar wa la dhirar. No harm, no harming. Islam does not permit harm. This hadith is not only sound and agreed upon, but it is the basis of a fiqhi principle. So every marja in the world accepts this as a fiqhi principle. As an example, if harm is coming towards you, you are obligated to do whatever you can to stop that harm. Understand? If you cannot stop all of the harm, you are obligated to reduce as much of the harm as possible. If you cannot reduce as much harm as possible, you are only permitted to allow the most least amount of harm to reach you. This is the mas'ala. And I'm giving it to you very elementary, very basically, so we can all understand. The Prophet says, La dharar wa la dirar. So now you are all up and coming mujtahideen. The biggest contributor to global warming is methane. And the biggest win that we can do is to stop methane, because it will actually burn up earlier than carbon dioxide. It's a double win. Now, what is the single greatest producer of methane in the world? Yeah, those lovely quarter pounder and half pounder meals that we eat. That lovely sirloin steak. Sirloin steak, is it? That everybody likes. Yeah. Actually, now everyone knows where this is going, huh? Okay. So, chickens. Well, we're going to talk about this. We're going to expand the masala to help everyone. Chickens, beef, pork. Obviously, you and I don't eat pork. But just to give you some context, I'm just going to read some basic statistics so that you understand what's happening. Cattle raised on pastures created by clearing the woodlands out create the most emission-intensive problem in the world. Cows produce large amounts of methane, which is the most potent greenhouse gas when they digest their food. Perhaps the biggest problem, which is the livestock, uses a third of global cropland and contributes 15% of global greenhouse emissions. A recent study stated that for every 4 pounds of beef you eat, it contributes as much global warming as if you flew from New York to London. A study in 2010 looked at how much water was needed to be able to grow vegetables, fruits, chickens, pigs, sheep, goat, and cow meat. And we found that, as an example, it takes 322 liters per kilogram of fruit, 322 liters of water per kilogram of fruit to grow that fruit for you and I. Beef, for you to have one cow grown for you to then be killed, 15,415 liters of water per kilogram of beef. You understand how much cropland, how much water needs to go in to produce one cow for you and I? There's many more studies. I won't bore you with everything. UN Food and Agricultural Organization states that livestock is about 40% of the global value of agricultural output and supports the livelihoods of 1.3 billion people. So if you get rid of these animals, 1.3 billion people and what they rely on for food, what they rely on for their livelihood will also drop. So we have a problem here, don't we? We see that the biggest contributor is methane. And the biggest contributor to methane is cows. But there are so many millions of people around the world that are reliant on it for their food and also for their health and for their economy. So now again, the marja has to deal with another problem. There's another mas'ala, there's another issue. Instead of just the principle of la dharar wa la dhirar, you're not allowed harm, you also have the qa'idah of muhim and aham. What is important, what is most important? I'm asking you a question. What is most important? Economy or life? Life. So we need to preserve the... Who said economy? You need to be in Boris Johnson's cabinet, huh? I need to protect 1.3 billion. This is muhim, isn't it? It's important. But what's more important is aham, to protect 7 billion people. So do I choose protecting life or protecting economy? Life. Can you see? Now the marja has to be able to deal with this issue. You will realize that when we eat the foods that we are eating, at the rate in which we are consuming these foods, we are helping to produce all of these greenhouse gas emissions that continues to cause the cycle of the problem. You're all mujtahideen, mashallah. How would you deal with this? What was that? Oh, mashallah. So someone said make it haram. Someone said put a limit of once a week. That's brilliant. Remember, I'm not saying this is a fatwa. I'm talking to you through the ijtihadi process so you can understand it and you can try to live your life accordingly. Hands up, who said haram? Who actually shouted out, mashallah? He's a bit meek. He's like, I'm not sure if the sheikh sees me or not. Now, before I go through the mas'ala, hands up, how many people, because you're all mujtahideen, mashallah, how many of you would make the consumption of meat haram? Not allowed harm. And the biggest harm is by meat consumption. Who here makes it haram? Interesting. And hands up, who here would say there needs to be a fatwa to reduce the amount of meat that we're eating? It's almost all, am I right? Almost all of everybody? I didn't see a single person put their hands up for making it haram. Clearly no one here is a vegan, because you would have already put your hand up. Yeah? So just for the sake of the camera and my sisters, I didn't see anyone put their hands up for haram, which I know everybody means that they're going out for something meat tonight. And I saw the majority of people say that there should be something that reduces, that puts us a limitation upon ourselves. Now I'm asking you a question. In ijtihad, can a marja make meat haram consumption? Can a marja make it limited? Sometimes maraja do make things haram for you, no? They do say you can't do this. His Eminence, Imam al-Khomeini, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, when he saw dhar, harm, for the Iranian Hujjaj that were going to go for Hajj, did he or did he not temporarily stop them? Did he or did he not? Yes, on the principle of dhar. I can't permit harm coming to them, and so he prohibited. And there were other considerations, political considerations and things as well. Now, the mujtahid goes where? First to the Quran. Everybody get out your Qurans. You should have known that was coming. I'm sorry. I'll show you a couple of ayat, and let's just think about how the mujtahideen would deal with something like this. Now remember, I'm not giving you fatwa, I'm just explaining to you process, introducing to you ayat, ahadith. You now learn the principle of dhar, and the principle of qa'idat al-muhim wal-aham. Choosing what is most important over that which is important. You have to balance these things. Okay, first ayah, chapter 5, verse 5. I'm only going to give to you 3 ayat, a couple of ahadith, and then we conclude, inshallah. Everybody's there? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Al-yawma uhillu lakum at-tayyibatu wa ta'amu alladhina utul kitaba hillun lakum wa ta'amakum hillun lahum. This day all good foods have been made lawful. So Allah says all foods are lawful for you, all good food is lawful for you. And the food of those who are given the scripture is lawful for you, and your food is lawful for them. Next verse, chapter number 6, verse 145. Surah Al-An'am. We are talking about cattle. Surah Al-An'am, cattle. Chapter 6, verse 145. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قل لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما على طاعم يطعمه إلا أن يكون ميتة أو دما مسفوحا أو لحم خنزير فإنه رجس أو فسقا. Say, I do not find within that which was revealed to me anything forbidden to one who would eat it, unless it is either a dead animals already dead, or blood spilled out, or the flesh of the swine, for indeed it is impure, or that it has been slaughtered in disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are you allowed to be able to make meat haram here, based on this ayah? No, there's no prohibition here. Last verse as an example, just to be able to show you how the Quran would talk about these things. Chapter number 6, verse number 38. Sorry, verse number 138. Chapter number 6, verse 138. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قالوا وقالوا هذه أنعام وحرث حجر لا يطعمها إلا من نشاء بزعمهم وأنعام حرمت ظهورها. And they say, these animals and crops are forbidden to eat. So someone says, it's haram for us to be able to eat all this meat. They say, these animals and crops are forbidden. No one may eat them except whom we choose should be allowed to eat them. This is their claim that they make. And there are those camels whose backs are forbidden by them, and those upon whose names Allah is not mentioned. All of this is an invention. عَلَيْهَا إِفْتِرَاءً عَلَيْهِ. All of these prohibitions that you have made is just an invention that you have created for yourselves. Allah will punish those who make an invention. So someone says, are we allowed to be able to just put an invention on to Allah and say what is halal to eat, haram to eat? No, we cannot do that. This is one thing. Now, what we find within the Sunnah is that there are certain animals that were made haram to eat temporarily. Were they made permanently haram? No. Why? Because the Quran tells you what is permanently haram and halal. But you know, in the ahadith, sometimes circumstances occur where a ma'soom has to temporarily tell you, this is haram, this is halal. We can change because we need to understand the circumstances of the time. You know, there was even a time when dyeing of the beard was made compulsory, and there was time when dyeing of the beard was removed from being made compulsory because of the circumstances. In our Sharia, you find that at times certain animals were temporarily prohibited. And these are accepted hadith, these are sound hadith in the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam. Hadith comes to us from both Muhammad bin Muslim and Zurara bin A'yun. I don't need to tell you, these are two of the greatest companions of our 5th and 6th Imam, Muhammad al-Baqir, Ja'far al-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhima. Muhammad bin Muslim and Zurara bin A'yun both asked Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam about the permissibility of eating the meat of a domesticated donkey. Ibn Rasulullah, are we allowed to eat this domesticated donkey? Why was that question raised? Do you think that these great companions didn't know the fiqh? Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam replied, the Messenger of Allah prohibited eating domesticated donkeys on the day of the Battle of Khaybar. Why? Imam continues. He temporarily prohibited eating it at that time only because it was a means of transport for people to take their weapons to the battlefield. Do you understand? So it's permissible to you to eat, but temporarily the Imam prohibited it. Why? قاعدة المهم والأهم. Muhim was eating. At that moment, Aham was winning the battle of Khaybar. And so he had to put in a temporary prohibition on something because what was more important came first. What was Aham was more important than Muhim. Another hadith, again, 6th Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. My father, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, was asked about eating the meat of a domesticated donkey. He replied, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi prohibited its eating because at that time it was a means of transport of people. What is permanently prohibited is what Allah has mentioned in the Quran. So you are all upcoming mujtahideen, mashaAllah. Does the Quran tell you you can prohibit what Allah has permitted permanently? No. Do you find within a hadith the potential allowance, the example, the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam to temporarily prohibit the eating of a certain type of meat? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes. Ijtihad is fun, huh? Then you come to the principles that help to navigate this issue. And that is, of course, لا ضرر ولا ضرار. قاعدة الأهم والمهم. I am not giving you fatwa. I'm having to repeat this because I know some people walk away going, Ja'far's giving fatwa. I'm not giving fatwa. I'm saying to you, understand how Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam dealt with these delicate matters and how you and I can deal with some of these delicate matters of our own time. When we understand the way Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam worked, it becomes a nur for you and I. It becomes a guiding light for you and I. When we realize that some of our behaviors are causing damage, irrevocable damage, it may be that we cannot make something haram upon us that Allah has made halal, but we can make serious change in our practices to limit, to reduce things that allows us to be able to reduce the impact, the harm that is being done. This is within the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam. The meat production is the largest, or is argued to be the largest contributor to global warming. The fisheries that we are decimating is on the verge of being wiped out, that by the time our children grow up, they will not be able to eat fish. The impact upon these two things that are happening in the world on course is going to be irrevocable. One may not be able to make it haram, but one can tell you that there is provision for you to be able to reduce it to a minimal amount. And this is something that you and I have to think about in our own practices. I cannot tell you what to do. What you can do is learn from Ahlul Bayt alayhim wassalam in the way in which they dealt with these matters. You all know the famous statement that the Prophet himself only ate meat once every 40 days. There is much wisdom in this, and you and I will be able to learn from much of this, and this is how you and I can begin to create and see a fiqh and ahkam of bi'ah for you and I in front of us, insha'Allah. For you and I, tonight is a heavy, heavy night. When you imagine the treatment of the children of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, our heart immediately goes to Ruqayyah and Sakina, salamullahi alayha. Her cries were so heavy upon Abu Fadil that he is desperate to go and get these children water. This is the furat that the dogs and the pigs and the horses drink from freely, that the tyrants drink from freely. But Bibi Sakina, salamullahi alayha, is unable to drink from this water. Aliyun al-Azghar is unable to drink from this water. I can imagine that Sakina goes into that tent where the mashk is kept. She opens it. She puts it towards her dry lips and not a single drop comes out. You can imagine that there are cries loudly, Al-Atash, Al-Atash, the thirst is killing us. You can imagine when Abu Fadl walks into the tent of Imam al-Hussein, tears are in his eyes, but tears are also coming from the eyes of Imam al-Hussein, for he knows that this will be the last time that he sees his brother Abu Fadl standing the way in which he is. The next time he will see him, there is going to be an arrow penetrated into his eye. His arms are going to be severed from his shoulders, and Imam is going to have to place his head in his lap. How does Hussein see Abbas in this moment? Imagine when Sakina comes to Abu Fadl and says, "Oh my uncle, we are dying of thirst. Is there any drop of water that you can bring for us?" I imagine what it must have been like for Sakina. She was the leader of all the children. She would have been standing outside of her tents. She would have seen the flag of Abu Fadl reach the banks of the river Euphrates, and then she would have seen it riding back towards the tents. I imagine she would have gone into the tents. She would have run towards her baby brother Asghar and said, "Abdullah, do not cry any longer. I see the flag of Abu Fadl returning. He must have water with him." But then I can imagine that when she returned out of that tent, she would have not seen the flag of Abu Fadl. And the way the flag would have fallen, so too would have her hopes of her uncle returning fallen.